Hey guys, Dim Gaming here, back with another retrospect, and as the video suggests, this retrospect is going to be on the Resident Evil 3 remake. Now in my retrospects, I normally go over the following things: my initial thoughts, that's my first playthrough of the game, what I liked and disliked, the characters, that's main and supporting cast, the gameplay and the gameplay mechanics, then we're going to jump into the storyline, and then we'll talk about replayability. Bear in mind, these are just my personal opinions, so not everyone is going to agree with me, but this is my personal opinion of Resident Evil 3 Remake. And without further ado, let's jump into the retrospect.
Resident Evil 3 Retrospect.
First things first, let's go over my initial thoughts of the game itself. I actually owned the game on Xbox One and PC, and my first complete playthrough was on the Xbox One, so I'll talk about my experience on that. My first impressions, starting off as Jill, I thought were a little bit odd because it was first person. However, I found it to be very atmospheric and quite creepy, so if that was Capcom's intention, then they definitely got that point across. Playing through the first part of the game, where you start off in first person and transition over to third person Jill in the present day after waking up from a nightmare, I thought was really awesome. It was different, but it still felt the same, if that makes any sense. I thought it was great how they introduced Nemesis as well, this mysterious figure smashing through the wall of Jill's apartment and then chasing you down without any logic or reason. I thought that was great. Even though the chase was obviously scripted and there wasn't much interaction, I thought it was very well done. A little side note as well, I was kind of glad that we got to see Jill's samurai edge as well, even if it was for the briefest of moments, and they also added a little Easter egg there to why she doesn't have it, as obviously it's her main sidearm in the original Resident Evil 3. After that, getting to meet Resident Evil 3 Remake Brad was really awesome. He looks exactly how I wanted him to, and he acts like how I wanted him to as well, so I have no problems with Brad as a character. It was really cool to see him. Even though he gets very limited screen time, it was still a great experience to see that character again, as he's one of my favourite characters. As awesome as the intro section of the game is, I feel it's a little bit too cinematic. It would have been a really cool experience to fight off hordes of zombies trying to get through the door in Bar Jack with Brad. However, I do feel that's a wasted opportunity on Capcom's part, however cool it was. One thing I think that was done very well in the Resident Evil 3 remake was character introduction. The way Nemesis was introduced was awesome, and in this footage you can see Carlos's introduction, which was probably, in my opinion now, the most badass introduction in any Resident Evil game. Who else has the balls to shoot Nemesis almost point blank with a 4-barreled rocket launcher? No one else but Carlos. That's pretty awesome. Getting to see the other members of Carlos's platoon was awesome as well. Getting to see Mikhail, Nikolai, Terrell and Murphy was pretty badass. Even though we don't get to see Murphy for very long, we do get a lot more interaction with Terrell, and I thought that was really cool, him and Carlos having this relationship, instead of him being a character that only has about 1 to 2 lines like he did in the original. Really cool that they added that in. He's basically one of the biggest supporting characters now. I'm not going to delve into characters anymore in this part of the retrospect because I have a category for that later, but ending up my initial thoughts, graphically this game is fantastic. The only thing I didn't like was the pacing felt a little bit off compared to the original game. It did feel a little bit more rushed. I do get that it fits the remake narrative more, but obviously there's going to be comparisons to the original as this is a remake / reimagining. Now let's segue into the next topic, which is my likes and dislikes about the game. As always, I'm going to start off with the good and finish with the bad. One of the things Resident Evil 3 Remake does well is the gameplay. It's very fluid and it's easy to pick up even for a more novice gamer. One thing I like, it still captures the essence of Resident Evil 3's original controls. Resident Evil 3 was obviously more action orientated, than Resident Evil 2, and this game definitely captures that. The dodge mechanic in particular. I was a really big fan of the dodge mechanic. In the original, it added different types of gameplay. Instead of trying to lure zombies to one side of the wall and dodging around them, as people would commonly do in Resident Evil 2, it just meant that a horde of zombies, you could push one off, push them back into other zombies, and clear your path. You can pretty much do the same thing here, however, the dodge is a little bit more fluid, and the addition to the perfect dodge makes that even more interesting. And it's fun to learn the enemy's patterns to figure out which way is better to dodging them. For example, dodging the zombies is a lot easier when they go to attack you. You dodge forward and left or forward and right, and you're more than likely going to get the perfect dodge. Another thing I think the game does really well is the storytelling aspect of the game. Let's use Jill and Carlos's relationship, for example. At the start of the game, she gets rescued by him, finds out he works for Umbrella. She's then very hesitant to trust him. However, throughout the game, she realizes that he's a very trustworthy and dependable character, and you see that relationship develop through cutscenes, interactions through the radio, and etc. To me, this is one of the strongest points of the game. This is what it does best. It tells a story of survivors within an apocalypse situation, and it does that very, very well. One of my favourite points about the game is you feel for the characters because of the storyline and the interactions. Keeping on the subject of the storyline still feels like Resident Evil 3, however, obviously there are going to be slight differences, otherwise you would know everything that's going to happen into the game. One of them being quite a big point of where Carlos, instead of Jill, goes to the RPD. I kind of like that and I kind of dislike that, so it's kind of a like and dislike. What we got was a really interesting scenario with Carlos that did actually answer one or two questions about the RPD itself, such as how the hole got in the wall on the second floor. Originally people thought it was Nemesis or Mr. X that smashed through it. It was actually Carlos with some C4, which I thought was really, really cool. Obviously, if you haven't seen the game, I'm not going to spoil the next part, but it does also show how Marvin gets his injury. I'm not going to say how he gets it. I thought it was really well done and quite sad what happened. However, it wasn't the same as what happens at that area of the RPD in the original, which I was a little bit disappointed not to see. Moving on to stuff that's the same, which I thought was done really well. The hospital part of the game is by far my favourite area of the game. It doesn't feel as rushed like some of the other areas of the game. You get to do a big chunk there, and you get to explore it quite a lot, and you even get to see a new type of enemy that you haven't seen in the previous parts of the game, which is great. That's probably the most well-paced part of the game. Most of the boss fights as well, opposed to maybe one or two of them, did feel the same as how they did in the original game. Basically, most of the Nemesis fights felt very similar and on the same grounds as Resident Evil 3 original, but they had their remake twist, which I really did enjoy. As I mentioned earlier, the game is graphically amazing. As you can see here, we're literally running up to a semi-destroyed parking lot to try and jump into a helicopter to escape. Visually, it looks fantastic. One thing that Capcom has done very well along the Resident Evil 2 and 3 remakes is the background surroundings. They're very, very detailed and full of life, which I really did enjoy, and it is no exception in Resident Evil 3 Remake. On that subject, I will just touch on my first dislike. Although the scenery was amazing, one thing I didn't like was there are a lot of cut areas from the original game, such as the park, the clock tower. Even though we get to go to the clock tower, we don't get to do anything in it. It's literally just there for a boss fight. It was a cool cameo for the location, but the clock tower is obviously quite an important part of the original game, so it was disappointing we didn't get to go there. So moving on to my next point, I don't want to touch on the lack of locations too much, because overall I was happy with what we got, but it would have been cool to see some more of those more iconic locations. One other thing I disliked As cool as Nemesis is in the remake, he just felt too scripted for me. They kind of made it sound like he was going to be a bit more free roaming to an extreme, even more so than how Mr. X was in the RPD and Resident Evil 2 remake, but unfortunately that just wasn't the case. The times he does chase you in stage 1 Nemesis form, you can easily get out of the way, and you can also stop that encounter quite quickly by just running from one area to the next. So I was a little bit disappointed in that. However, I will just touch that I did enjoy the boss fights later on. Some of them were quite challenging, especially on the first playthrough when you had to figure them out. Another thing is, I felt that certain types of enemies were very segregated into their own little sections. For example, the Drain Demos. As much as I hated them because they were annoying and they would jump from wherever to try and get you, they were only in the one part of the game, which was kind of annoying. I think they missed an opportunity, because it would have been interesting to come around a corner and then get jumped by a Drain Demos right in the middle of Raccoon City, or even in the hospital, for example. I think that's another missed opportunity there. Keeping on the subject of enemies, the fact that Gravedigger wasn't included in Resident Evil 3 Remake is kind of annoying. I do kind of get that, considering we don't go to the park, that kind of doesn't make that much sense. However, we do go into the sewer area, so maybe it would have been cool to include him in there. Gravedigger's just one of those iconic Resident Evil enemies that everyone loved and loved to hate, myself included. So it's kind of a little bit disappointing that he's not in the game, because I was looking forward to fighting him again. But now let's move on to the characters. Initially I'm going to talk about Jill and Carlos, Nikolai and Nemesis, because to me they're the two protagonists and antagonists of the game. Let's talk about Jill, considering she is the main character. I think Capcom have done an amazing job with Jill. She still feels like the Jill of old, however adding a new twist. And I'll explain why I think that. So, Jill from the original Resident Evil 3 was very sassy, and she was a bit of a badass. I still very much feel that Remake 3 Jill is very sassy, and continues to be that badass of old. She very much feels like the same Jill I love. Jill is pretty much my favourite character in Resident Evil, especially the Resident Evil 3 Jill, so I was very happy with the Jill we got. The new design makes more sense as well. I mean, realistically, as cool as the costume was in the original, who wears a boob chop and a miniskirt in a zombie apocalypse? I think her new outfit is more quickly thrown together, rough and ready for a zombie apocalypse. I really enjoyed it. I know a lot of people didn't like the new Jill we got. They said she was a bit too tomboyish, but Jill is supposed to be a bit of a tomboy, which I think she still keeps her femininity, but she has that tomboy appeal as well, so I think there was a good middle ground that they established there. Overall, this portrayal of Jill is probably my favourite. I really do enjoy the original, however this just brings something new to the table while keeping that old classic Jill feel. I do enjoy some of her one-liners quite a bit in this game. Like when Nemesis is on fire and falls into a river, she says the classic line, "Bitch can't even swim." Love that line. Let's now move on to Carlos, and oh boy did Carlos get an upgrade. I absolutely love Carlos in the Resident Evil 3 Remake. His role was expanded greatly, and I think that was one of my favourite parts of Resident Evil 3. Again, he still feels like old Carlos. His attitude is the same, however he's had a bit of a facelift, and I personally do much rather enjoy the Resident Evil 3 Remake version of him. Being able to play as Carlos in the RPD and the hospital sections of Resident Evil 3 Remake was amazing. It gave us more chance to explore him as a character and how he deals with these situations, which I really did enjoy. Also, it was interesting that Jill's dodge is obviously a defensive maneuver, whereas Carlos's version is actually a shove or a punch, making him more an aggressive character instead of an evasive character, which I quite liked. Also, it was nice to see him get more interactions with the characters. Obviously he interacts with Mikhail Nikolai, but it was cool to see him have this sort of bromance with Tyrell, which was really cool in itself. Let's move on to Nemesis. Now, Nemesis was a bit of a controversial topic for many people, initially myself included. However, when I first got to see him in Remake 3, I thought he was awesome from the get-go. I was worried that they were going to change him too much. However, he looks awesome and even more creepy than he did in the original, but I do have a few problems with him. While creepy and a constant pursuer in the areas he's in, he is scripted for the most part, unfortunately, and that was my biggest gripe with him. Nemesis as a character was still awesome, utilizing various weapons to chase you down. The boss fights you have with him as well, I bet the last one, were awesome. The last one was a little bit lackluster in my opinion, but the other ones, especially the Clock Tower Nemesis fight, which was probably my favourite, were awesome and well constructed. Overall, I feel he's more creepy in this game. That's probably due to the change in technology and the fact that we can make things look more lifelike. However, I still do prefer the Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, just for the fact that he can pursue you at semi-scripted times instead of purely scripted times like he does in Remake 3. Now let's move on to Nikolai. Nikolai in the original Resident Evil 3 was awesome, cold and calculated, and I think they've definitely amplified that in this iteration. He's a character you love to hate. He's so cool, but he's such an arse at the same time. They did a great job with Nikolai, and I love the way they took him in this. I'm not going to do any spoilers, but obviously there is only one ending in Resident Evil 3 Remake instead of the two we get, so you don't get to see one of the scenes with Nikolai, but I'm quite happy with the ending and how the story ended for Nikolai, or didn't end technically. I'll just add as well, there's one scene in particular with Nikolai that made me feel like he's a complete creep. It's the Nemesis Clock Tower fight. The fact he appears after that all happens kind of makes you think, was he watching me the whole time, and how long has he been watching me for? It's kind of creepy, but at the same time, you wouldn't not expect that from his character. Now I'm going to touch on the supporting cast. I'm not going to spend as much time on them as they are the supporting cast, but let's start off with Tyrell. Tyrell in the original obviously wasn't in the game for that long, either blowing himself up with a grenade or already being dead, but they greatly expanded his role, which I was really happy with. It was kind of cool to see Carlos have a kind of companion character whilst being Jill's companion character himself. It was nice to see that as tough as Carlos is, he still needs help from one of his teammates, Tyrell, and I think their chemistry was quite good in the scenes they shared. Now again, I'm not going to give any spoilers on to what happens to him in the game, although I will say it was one of the things I enjoyed most, giving his character a bit more of a spotlight and a more prominent role in Resident Evil 3 Remake, so good job on that, Capcom. Now let's move on to one of my favourite characters in Resident Evil in general. That's Mikhail Victor. I was really pleased to see Mikhail. His role isn't changed really at all, but he does get a little bit more screen time instead of being already mortally wounded on the train car. He is still wounded, however, but he's able to be up and around and help command the rest of his forces. Again, really enjoyed how they portrayed Mikhail, and it was just really cool to see him, as he's one of my favourite characters. It's a shame we won't be getting mercenaries so I can play as him again in nowadays graphics. Let's move on to Murphy. Not really much to say about Murphy. His role is pretty much exactly the same, however there is only one way that he gets killed in this. Instead of potentially being able to be killed by Carlos, he gets killed by Nikolai right in front of Jill, pretty much a minute and a half after you see him, so nothing is different there, which is a shame because maybe his character could have had more potential, but they kept that by the book to the original. Now let's move on to two of the RPD characters, Marvin and Brad. Really enjoyed Brad. I thought he kind of had a bit of a redemption, but then they kind of reversed that as well in the same game, but I thought him sacrificing himself and getting bitten for Jill. A little bit of a spoiler there, but it's in the first 4 minutes of the game, so that's the only spoiler I'm going to try and give. But it was kind of cool to see he was a bit more noble in sacrificing himself potentially for his teammate Jill. So that was really, really cool, and it was good to see him. He was exactly how I wanted Brad to be, instead of the one we got in the original where he was a complete coward. He actually had some more redeeming qualities in this. It was great to see Marvin again as well. Marvin is one of my fan favorites. My fan favorites are Brad, Kendo, and Marvin, and they're all in this game, which is awesome. But it was great to see Marvin, and they also did confirm the plot hole of who injured Marvin and why he tells Leon to not hesitate. Again, I'm not going to spoil that for the people that haven't played it, but it was a really awesome and heart-wrenching scene because Marvin's just a great character and it kind of sucks to see what happened to him. But it was really well done and probably one of the most emotional parts of the game. And finishing the support characters on an emotional high or a low, depending on how you look at it, let's talk about Robert Kendo. Everyone knows me that I love Robert Kendo. He is my top fan favorite character out of the three I mentioned before, and he's just got such a tragic story in the remakes, and it's kind of interesting to see him at the stage a little bit before we see him in Resident Evil 2, but his whole story is so tragic, and he probably gets about 5 to 6 minutes of screen time between both of the games. It's quite sad, but it was so well done, and that was the most heart-wrenching moment from both games, is Robert Kendo. Really well acted, you really feel for the character as well, so that was superbly done on Capcom's part. And we don't technically see him get eaten by zombies in either game, so that's a massive bonus to me. It's not a spoiler because obviously we don't fully know what happens to him after that, because Ghost Survivors isn't canon. But yeah, that is my take on the characters and how I feel about them. Now this brings us perfectly onto the gameplay and storyline section of the retrospect. I'll start off with the gameplay. The gameplay itself feels very much like Resident Evil 2. It is on the same engine and the controls are relatively exactly the same. However, there are a few things I want to highlight which are different and make Resident Evil 3, in my opinion, a better game mechanic wise. One interesting thing I liked, which they didn't have in Resident Evil 2, is the fact that you can quick pick up items. If you're running past, for example, a bunch of handgun bullets, you can run past them, press the action button, and it will just put them in your inventory instead of you having to potentially stop quickly for it to then show going into your inventory. I kind of liked that. It made the gameplay flow a little bit better, and it just made it a little bit easier in my opinion. The return of the dodge is something that I'm super happy about. It's one of my favourite Resident Evil mechanics in any of the Resident Evil games. I loved it in the original and I love it even more in the remake. It's a very fun, fluid action, which means you can get in and around zombies and other BOWs such as Nemesis quite quickly, but there is a downside. You have to time it correctly. If you don't, you can still get hit. There were many times on my first and second playthroughs where Nemesis would still whoop me only for the fact that I hadn't figured out the dodge properly. So that was a great feature which was good in the original but is great in the remake. Just dwelling a little bit more on the dodge mechanic. Obviously in Resident Evil 3 Remake we don't get defense items. If we had defense items and the dodge, it would be a little bit too overpowered, I believe. The dodge is quite effective on its own, so I feel that we don't need defense items. However, you can still get defense items, but they come in the form of just being throwables. And the knife obviously is its own weapon, which is, in my opinion, a little bit better. And the fact it doesn't have durability made more sense to me. One thing I like about the controls is they still feel slightly tanky, which I thought is quite a good throwback to the originals. They don't feel as fluid as some of the other titles such as Resident Evil 6, which is literally just a third-person shooter in my opinion. It still did feel like standard survival horror controls in a game, which is great. I'm not sure about yourselves, but I do feel that the mechanics of the zombies, they did feel a little bit more janky. I'm not sure if that was intended, but they didn't feel like the exact same zombies which are chasing you down in the RPD and other areas in Resident Evil 2 Remake. They just felt a little bit more janky, so I felt like I personally had to pick my shots a little bit more in Remake 3. Now let's move on to the storyline in Resident Evil 3 Remake. I'm gonna have some good and bad points because I didn't think it was perfect, like a lot of people. As always, I'll start with the good and finish with the bad. So let's jump on to the good points. Overall, I really did enjoy the storyline in Resident Evil 3 Remake. It did take a lot of cues from the original one, as did Resident Evil 2 Remake, which was good. Yes, there were differences, but overall I was happy with the storyline that we got in Resident Evil 3 Remake. Although some of the pacing was off, I did feel like the story did flow well, and it kind of progressed quite nicely, if a little bit rushed. From a character point of view in the storyline, I thought they all felt like their old selves for the most part, but they did have a new twist which added and complemented the new storyline, so I was quite impressed with that. So they were just some of the good points, but I do have a few gripes with the storyline. I did mention that the pacing was off, and I genuinely do feel it was. However, I did feel that for the most part you did go through the game in most of the same order you do in Resident Evil 3 Original. I bet Carlos going to the RPD and the clock tower pretty much making a location cameo, which was a bit of a shame, and that's a topic I'm going to touch on in a second. Although the storyline was great, it was a shame that we didn't get some of the locations such as the park and the clock tower, as personally they were some of my favourite parts in the game. I love the park section so much that this whole video has had the park soundtrack from the Resident Evil 3 original game. So I was a little bit disappointed that we didn't get those areas. However, it doesn't actually make that much sense that we did get those areas in the same capacity or at all, because it didn't fit the narrative of Resident Evil 3 Remake. It's just a shame that they weren't added, as obviously we did get to fight Stage 2 Nemesis in the clock tower, which was cool, but I wish there was more, I just really do. Now, if you haven't played the entire game, this is my spoiler warning for what I'm about to say. So the storyline was good overall, however there are just a few points at the end which I didn't like. The Nemesis fight was a little bit weak. I do know that on Inferno and Nightmare he is way harder, but on the difficulties I've played so far, I basically played Assisted, Standard and Hardcore. He just isn't much of a challenge. However, they do, in my opinion, make up for that, as I really did enjoy the ending when you defeat Nemesis and go to escape. Really did enjoy that. I thought that was kind of making up for it for a bit of a lame final boss fight. So to sum up the storyline, overall I did enjoy it, however I just wish we had less content cut and it was a bit more fleshed out. But unfortunately, that's not what happened, so this is the game we got. Now let's move on to the replay value of the game and my final thoughts of it. Personally, this game doesn't have as much replay value as Resident Evil 2 Remake, as there is only one scenario. However, there are cool things like the records section of the game. The records section basically just gives you a bunch of things to do to unlock points to use in the provided shop that you get in the game after completing it for the first time, thus making you play differently. For example, if you need to use the assault rifle to kill 400 enemies, if you don't normally use the assault rifle, it will make you use it a little bit more just to get those points. Some of the shop items are quite interesting, such as you can get extra hit packs, you can get a knife which sets enemies on fire called the Hot Dogger, and you can get Jill's Stars outfit, which I'm using in the B-roll in the background. So there are a ton of things you can do, and it just makes you play through your game differently. So in that respect, it's quite good, but there isn't much more replay value than that. Now let's move on to my final thoughts, and I also will give this a rating out of 10. I do this with every one of my retrospects. So my final thoughts on the game. Storyline is great, if a little bit short. The character development was awesome. My favourite point of the game is the character development. I loved that. Nemesis is really cool, however some of the boss fights are a little bit lackluster. Unfortunately, quite a bit of the original game was obviously cut content, which is a shame, and I think Capcom missed out on a great opportunity there. But I do respect them for taking a leap of faith. However, it obviously didn't work out that well from feedback from other fans. The gameplay is great and fluid, another aspect I really did enjoy of the game. I would still recommend this to newer players of Resident Evil, however I would probably recommend this over the original to a new player. Otherwise, if they play the original and then come to the remake, they'll be on a similar opinion to most of the older Resident Evil fans, myself included, that it was just a bit lackluster. So let's move on to the final part, which is my rating out of 10. I can tell you now it won't get as high a rating as Resident Evil 2 Remake, and that is for the following reasons. The fact that the content was cut, less replay value, and the fact that we didn't get Mercenaries mode, because Mercenaries mode is fantastic. So I give Resident Evil 3 an 8 out of 10. Although it's a great entry, I just don't think it had the same impact as Resident Evil 2 Remake. And if the games were released the opposite way around, 3 being first, I still think that would be the case. But that's it for my retrospect, guys. Let me know what you think in the comments below. I always love your feedback, and I always love to hear what you think about the games I'm talking about. But until next time, this is Simmersdim Gaming, and I'll see you in the next one.